So now that we've seen some of the challenges that happen when land tenure and property rights thinking does not take place before a disaster, I'd now like to focus on ways in which we can be proactive and sort of address land tenure and property rights issues and needs in terms of disaster risk reduction. So we'll look at three things right now, specifically contingency planning, looking at the ways in which we can strengthen land administration and institutions, and then how land tenure allows us to think, builds what we can call resilience thinking and preparedness. So I'd like to show you a video clip right now about contingency planning in Bangladesh. So let's move to that.
আমি তখন জানতাম না বন্যা আসলে কি করতে হয় আমার খুব ভয় ছিল তখন
মনে করেন যে বাড়ির ভিতরে এতটুকু করে পানি হয়েছিল ঘরের ভিতরে এইখানে করে পানি হয়েছিল
মনে করেন যে আগে মনে করেন যে বন্যা বেশি হয়েছে চকির উপরে বাচ্চা নিয়ে চালের উপরে উঠছি
চৌকি ছিল চৌকির উপর চৌকি রাখতাম তার উপরে আমরা ছেলেটাকে নিয়ে থাকতাম এবং চতুর্পাশ দিয়ে সাপ কলকল করে যেত
তাতে মনে করে এই বাচ্চাটা পানিতে পড়ে গেছিল পড়ে যাওয়ার পর আর একবারে মরে পানিটা নিয়ে খায় পেটটা ফুলে আর মরার অবস্থা হয়েছিল শরীর খুবই অসুস্থের মধ্যে আছে বাচ্চা
কলের মুখ তলা গেছে গা কিসের পানি খামো মনে করেন যে মেলা কিছু ডায়রি হয়েছে জ্বর আসছে কলের গুঁড়া পাকা করি এখন মনে করেন যে ট্রেনিং পার পরে মনে করেন যে শিখছি আগে জানি নাই মনে করেন যে আগে অনেক বিপদে আছে
স্কেচ ভাইয়েরা মনে করেন যে আমাদের সহযোগিতা করাতে ট্রেনিং করাতে সুমতি করাতে আমরা এখন মেলাখানি আগে আগেছি আলোচনা করে আমরা আগে সচেতন হয়ে থাকি মানে দুর্যোগে আমাদের কোনো ক্ষয়ক্ষতি না করতে পারি
হচ্ছে বেশি ঝুঁকিপূর্ণ মানে নদী এলাকা নদী এলাকা মানে নদীর সাইডে ভাঙা এলাকা এগুলো বেশি
ঘর তুফানে হতে ঘরটা ক্ষতি হয়ে যেতে পারে খুঁটিটা লাগাইতেছে শক্ত করার জন্য মাটি কেটে উঁচা করা
আমার বাড়ি এখন উঁচা হয়েছে আমার বাড়িতে এখন বন্যা আসে না আর জল উঠার ভয় নাই ভাঙার ভয় নাই
বন্যার টাইমে অসুবিধা হলো পাক শাকের অসুবিধা হলো শুকনা চুলা শুকনা খড়ি
মাছা উঁচু করি মনে করেন যে ওই যে পাট রাখছি তারপরে মনে করেন শুকনো খাবার ঘরে রাখছি ট্রেনিং করার পরে মনে করেন যে দুর্যোগ আসার ভয়ে মনে করেন যে আমরা একটা শিখছি
দুর্যোগের ট্রেনিং পাওয়ার পর আমরা এখন বন্যা আসার আগেই আর গর্ভবতী মহিলা যদি বৃদ্ধ মানুষ থাকে এবং ছোট বাচ্চা থাকে বন্যা আসার আগে আমরা এগুলো নিরাপদের স্থানে পাঠিয়ে দিই
দুর্যোগ সাজাওয়ার পরে পানি নামে গেল মাটি ধার হইলো গর্দগাতা বাড়া গেল তো ওই জায়গায় মাটি দেওয়া হয় লেফা পোছা করা হয় ডায়রিয়া হলে গেলে খাবার স্যালাইন তৈরি করা হয় মিঠাই দিয়া লবণ দিয়া
দুর্যোগে আসার আগে কি করতে হবে দুর্যোগে চলাকালীন কি করতে হবে এবং দুর্যোগ যাওয়ার পরে কি করতে হবে এই জিনিসগুলো আমাদের শিখেছি
আনার বন্যার সমস্যা নাই আগে মনে করেন তো ওগুলো বন্যার সমস্যা হয়েছে বাচ্চা কাচ্চার ক্ষতি হয়েছে আমাদের ক্ষতি হয়েছে সংসারে এখন আর এই সমস্যাটা আমাদের
ধন্যবাদ
So now you've just seen a video clip of how contingency planning has taken place in a particular riparian floodplain in Bangladesh. And if you go back and think about the West Africa example in the issue brief, these two examples of Bangladesh and West Africa sort of point to a few things, right? One is to do these enumeration exercises to identify sites for temporary evacuation, and storage of assets. Also focusing on the ways in which if you are going to relocate people and move assets, thinking about the ways in which you need to have these potential movements mutually agreed upon. So if you're moving to a place where you don't own that land, having some kind of agreement with that landowner, allowing for temporary movement of people and things in the context of preparing for a disaster and in that immediate period following a disaster. Also, the ways in which community-based mapping exercises were used to sort of visually display where people were located, where assets were located, where different plots of land were located. However, you might notice that in that Bangladesh example, land tenure is not really spoken about. It's sort of assumed, right? So when we see these exercises taking place in this Bangladesh example, we see these maps being drawn, there's really no discussion about the land tenure conditions or issues around who owns what on these maps. So what I would like you to do, and what I'm going to encourage you to do, is to go back and look at that video. And I want you to think about what would be the questions, if you were in that scenario, if you were in that village doing that contingency planning, which was silent sort of on land tenure issues, and we know that land tenure or secure tenure is the exception and not the norm, that if you were to be based in that exercise, what questions about land tenure would you want to ask in that context? If you were running a contingency planning exercise at the community level, what are the land tenure questions that you would want to ask? I encourage you to do that because I think that would make an excellent exam question at the end of this course. So, thinking about contingency planning. The next thing to think about is building land tenure administrations that are robust and that are well documented. Right? Ways in which we think about managing records, right? So if we're going to focus on building land tenure administration systems prior to a disaster, where are we going to keep these documents that we produce in these enumeration exercises? Really technical nitty-gritty stuff about where do we store data? Because data storage is incredibly important in thinking about being resilient, because if you don't have access to information, it's very hard to engage in decision-making in a post-disaster scenario. So thinking about ways in which, where do we store our records? How do we back our records up? How do we access our information, right? Putting all of this pre-systems thinking in place so that it's there if we encounter a situation where we really need to rely on land records to recover and restore losses. Again, thinking about ways in which these exercises specifically focus on land use policies. We can make land administrative institutions more robust and more responsive and perhaps more relevant if institutional actors or people that sit in these locations have the space to review their policies, think about their policies, and think about land use and land use planning in the context of global environmental change. A lot of disaster risk reduction planning is really forecasting exercises. It's thinking into the future about what might happen. So if we're working in an island nation that is threatened by sea level rise, how do our administrative systems, land systems, need to be revamped, rethought, reorganized in the face of sea level rise, for example? Or if we work in hilly terrain environments where we have certain slopes and we have monsoonal systems and landslides, where do we think about agricultural policies and practices in terms of agriculture on steep slopes, right? Thinking about the ways in which land administrative systems, one, pay attention to how they document and save and store their information, but also going through the review process so that their policies, laws, and procedures are up to date and internalize some of this thinking around global environmental change, slow onset disasters, and some of these other disasters related to climate and weather patterns. Finally, we can look at the voluntary guidelines, again, as a guide to thinking about how we want to incorporate land tenure issues into planning. Specifically, there's an important clause that are in those voluntary guidelines that talk about the ways in which contingency planning should not infringe on the rights of others to pursue their lives and livelihoods, right? That's why previously I said, if you're going to do contingency planning, you need to have this mutually agreed upon arrangement between the two parties, so that the party that is sort of hosting people or would host people in a situation, that we don't have an infringement on their rights to pursue their lives and livelihoods as a result of relocation. And so thinking about contingency planning and land and contingency planning, land issues and attention to land issues in building more robust and resilient land administrative institutions, right? Which is then brings me to how we can think about community enumeration, these exercises that engage in horizontal integration and vertical integration that would make land tenure institutions or land administrative institutions more robust. That is what we say incorporates what we say is resilience thinking, right? Resilience thinking and doing community enumeration exercises and documentation exercises and rights and use and access discussion exercises by bringing people together to think about their relationships to one another and the places that they live in the context of perhaps increasing risk to disasters. That is an example of resilience thinking, because you're thinking about and you're planning about the future and what steps can you take to make your communities or your institutions or your families more resilient. Enumeration exercises then also reflect what we call resilience practice. It's the practice of bringing people together, diverse groups of people together in an integrated way so that they know who one another is, they know what each role of an institution or a community is in that community, creating those opportunities for social networking, understanding rights and resources, builds the social cohesion and the social networks that are really important in building resilient communities, documenting livelihood strategies, documenting land use strategies. Having government institutions forward think about where land fits in their overall development portfolios, and is their development trajectory that they think that they're going to go on for land use planning, how does that align with some of the natural hazards that might be happening in that area that they're targeting for development, right? So it's including natural disasters into planning and systems thinking. Some other issues to think about after we're done today is to think about the importance of ensuring that when we do community enumeration exercises, we include that diverse range of stakeholders so we have a more robust understanding of how land is used, when particular places are used, under what circumstances, and by whom. By including women, ethnic minority groups, the elderly, and youth, not only into those exercises themselves, but also into information awareness campaigns or any sort of documentation that we would want to create around land and disaster risk reduction. So that means thinking about audience. If we go back to that example about self-settlement, one of the things about self-settlement was, the ways in which the project was designed wasn't really reflective of the audience that it was meant to serve, which is why so many people had a difficult time doing it. Same thing with disaster risk reduction. Thinking about what is the audience that we're trying to serve and creating our communication and information materials to meet the needs of that audience. Also, thinking about the ways in which we can use technology better. The ways in which we can use, mobile phones or maps or computerizing records to make our land tenure systems more robust. Also, if we think about the use of the mobile phone and the ways in which that has proliferated around society, how can we use that technology to empower communities to go out and document their own land rights? And there's actually an example of that in Haiti in the issue brief. So then to conclude for today, let's ask ourselves, why does land tenure matter in the context of disaster, right? I'm going to say these are our takeaways for today, right? One, because it helps us to address the underlying causes of vulnerability that would exacerbate disaster and thereby slow down recovery. Two, it helps to make our communities and our institutions better able to respond. In other words, it promotes resiliency. If you think about land tenure, and where land sits in planning and reconstruction, you're automatically integrating that into a resilience kind of thinking. And then finally, because it would reduce conflict. In any sort of scenario where we have scarce resources, there's always going to be conflict, right? So if we can delineate in a transparent way and provide people with secure tenure or secure enough tenure or rights to the lands that they use for their livelihoods and where they live, if we can do that in a transparent, well-organized way, we will also be able to reduce potential conflicts. So finally, another final thought is to think about, if we do all of these exercises, being inclusive, being transparent, being organized, using technology, we also sit at the heart of what we call good governance, right? If we find ways to include people into economic growth strategies, include people in more social networks, that creates more robust and therefore resilient communities that can respond to disaster. That is also part of good governance and lays that foundation for building a better society. Thank you.